All right, guys, today we are going to do language via audio lecture slash video. I planned on doing this one in person over Zoom, but to some personal circumstances outside of my control, we're going to have to go with this because I have business to attend to tomorrow in the afternoon when we would normally have class. So I will see you on Zoom on Wednesday. If you have questions while we're going over thinking and problem solving, if you have stuff about language, linguistics, anything about this, please let me know and we will for sure talk about it and go over as much stuff as you need. All right, so when we look at the definition of language here, it's just a means of communication, right? It's the way we communicate with another individual, and it can look a bunch of different ways. We can have, verbal, written, body language, nonverbal language, which are different things. There's lots of different abilities in how we communicate or how we, quote, use language. So when we look at the definition of language, or a good definition of it, not the definition, but a good definition, symbols that convey meaning, and then these symbols have rules in how to combine them, and then they can generate an infinite variety of messages. It's very rare you will hear the same exact long phrase twice in your life because there's so many words out there, there's so many ways to phrase things, that it's all unique. So I always think language is just super cool because, yeah, it's basically a bunch of letters that we form into words, and the letters aren't really letters. They're just weird symbols that we've attributed meaning to. And then when you put all those letters in order, they make words, which apparently have meaning. And then you have to put words in the right order, following all these grammatical rules in order for them to make sense. And then you get you get to embody your thoughts, right? You get to paint a picture for somebody verbally. And it's amazing how these symbols we've ascribed meaning to can do so much to help us envision and learn about the world and just change the world. So when we look at languages, we can start out with phonemes and morphemes. And so phonemes are the smallest unit of sound in a language. Sound is the key word here. It is the smallest sound that we can make. It does not mean the sound has actual meaning. So for the English language, there's about 44. So there's 26 letters in the alphabet, right? Each of those have a sound. Some of them make different types of sounds. And then you also have things like st, like ST, and then TH, right? All of those are also considered phonemes. They're sounds. So I always think of phoneme like on the phone, you hear words, you hear the sounds of the letters, or there used to be hooked on phonics to help kids learn how to read. When you practice phonics, it is sounding out the word. So if you've ever heard somebody say spell it phonetically, I know I've said that to you guys. Phonics, phonetic, it just means the sound of the letters. It does not mean that you know what they mean or that they even have meaning. So like b, we know it means bee, like that's a sound that a bee makes, but it also doesn't have an actual tactile meaning of like b isn't anything, right? It's just a sound of a letter. Then we have morphemes, which are the smallest unit of meaningful sound. So instead of it just representing a letter, it represents an item, a thing, an idea. So a, or, but, those are all examples. It can also be prefixes and suffixes. So if you have like di, like di or bi, bi means two. Mono, prefix right there. Pre, we know it comes before. Could be suffixes like an ing or an ed. Can even be an s. So if I said, I'm trying to think here of a good one, you could have cat. If we looked at the word cat and looked at phonemes, it would have three. At. Morphemes, the word cat has one, cat. But if I said, okay, how many morphemes for the word cats? And it'd have two. Cat, s. The S is a morpheme all by itself because it means plural. It adds an extra unit of meaning to it. We know it pluralizes things. So it can be as simple as that. Other words like cupcake, cup, cake, two morphemes. Cup is its own, cake is its own, right? Those each individually mean something, and they're small units of language. Now, when we talk about language, you have to know that all languages have grammar. It's rules of language. My cat is eating my hair. Rules of language just mean that there are ways we have to present things in the English language, but if you've taken like other languages like Spanish, all their grammar is like, it's different. The rules of where you put certain words in what order, they're very different than English. So syntax is one of the rules that we follow with grammar. It's the order of words in a language. So if I look at this, it's the White House. Or like if I told you, oh, I live in the blue house on my street. Like I say blue house or White House. Versus if I had said in Spanish, right? If you take Spanish, that's the only one I know because that's what I took. So sorry if you don't speak Spanish. It would not be White House or I live in a blue house. It would be the opposite. It would be house white or house blue, you know, casa azul. And that's because in their language, that noun comes first and the adjective or the descriptor word comes after, versus in the English language, it's the opposite. So syntax is the order that words have to go in order for them to fit the right grammatical rules. So your book talks about semantics and syntax, and they're kind of hard to get, you know, hashed out. Semantics is, does it make sense? So this is grammatically, it's structured correctly in terms of the words, like a noun being before this or that, but it doesn't even make conceptual sense. So cows flow supremely, right? You have your noun, you have your verb, and then you have your descriptor of that verb. It's in the right order, but I don't know about you. I don't know what a cow flowing means, and I don't know how you flow supremely. That doesn't make semantical sense, even though it's in the right order. So this sentence has syntax. It does not have semantics. The meaning is not there. Versus syntax, the black is cat, right? I can tell what you're trying to say. Like if somebody was speaking English for the first time, I'd be like, oh, you mean the cat is black, right? It's gonna make sense. Semantics would be there if they had it in the right order. So syntax is, the order is incorrect. So when we have to look at language, we have to look at the different stages language goes through. So if you start a new section in your notes here, I would have the stages of language. First stage, we call it reflexive communication, or it's just random. So I always think reflexive, random. Reflexive communication means it is a reflex of a baby to vocalize. It has no meaning. It doesn't always have a purpose. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes babies cry or fuss or whine or make weird noises just because they're reflexively acting on the fact that they have vocal cords and they can use them. So this happens between 1 to 5 months. It's about the age range. And it's when babies are cooing, they laugh, they cry, and they do vocal play. So sometimes you'll hear babies like making really weird noises. And it doesn't necessarily always mean that they're happy or sad or whatever. Sometimes they're just seeing what they can do. So my kid did it a long time ago, but I have a 10-month-old niece, and I remember when she was little, my sister would always get like, I don't know why she's crying, she's making all these noises, and I was like, no, she's just messing, like she's just trying to see what kind of sounds she can make. And maybe if it's her like letting out a shriek, it could be just because she's like, oh, that's a new sound, I didn't know I could do that. So these sounds do not mimic human speech patterns. They are not trying to sound like the rhythm of human speech. They're not really copying your voice, right? So at this stage, they're not mimicking you in any way. They're just randomly making noises. Now, yeah, they cry because they need something maybe, but some of their noises too, like just whines. I was just over at my aunt's house tonight, and my cousin has a brand new baby that's like maybe a month old. And yeah, he just makes noise. I swear, sometimes he just does it to hear himself talk. It's exactly what it is. He is just doing it because he can some of the time. Sometimes it's because he wants mom. Sometimes it's just he's randomly vocalizing. After they hit around 6 months old, they enter the babbling phase. This is much more mimicking of human speech patterns. They're usually not saying tons of words at this time. Sometimes they're not saying any words. And they're just verbalizing. So this would be like when you talk to a baby, when you go down and they're like 6, 7 months old, and you go, hi, how are you? And they go, blah, and just make a noise back. Or they go, blah, 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 blah. Okay, whatever ridiculous noise you want to put in here. There's a back and forth, right? It's like you're having a conversation, except they're not saying anything. That's babbling. they may begin to mimic speech patterns. So if you say, how are you doing today? They'll go, bah, like mimic the tone of your voice, right? They start paying attention more and picking up on not always language in essence, but like the rhythm and tones of language. So this is the babbling stage. Around 10 months old, they start using their first word. So sometimes, like, I think my kid and my niece, they both quote said their first word earlier than 10 months, but it was like they were just practicing saying stuff. You know, my kid said mama without knowing I was mama. It was because he just said mama, 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 mama. It did not mean mama. There wasn't really like a hard purpose behind it. It was he practiced that syllable. He figured out how to make it with his lips and his tongue. It didn't really have concrete meaning. Versus around 10 months old, they start saying their first words where they know what it typically means, right? So like if they say ball, they know what a ball is. Versus mama, baba, dada, they know what these things are. And it's them like labeling their universe at this time. Then around 12 months to 18 months, remember every kid does it at their own pace, you have the one word sentence stage, and vocabulary starts to grow really slowly. So one word sentence, it might be like ball. Ball means get the ball, right? It's not, they're not gonna say get me the ball, and they're no longer just labeling items. It's a one word that means an entire sentence sometimes to some extent, right? Go, up, all these things mean like up means pick me up, go means I want to go, things like that. So they do have over and under extensions that happen. So an overextension, child incorrectly uses a word to describe a wider set of objects or actions. So ball, maybe when they learn ball, like my kid, when he learned ball, he assumed anything round was a ball. So even like the orange on our kitchen counter, he was like ball, you know, or like I know my mom's favorite story from when I was a baby. I love being able to say ball, ball, ball. Well, she let me touch Christmas ornaments, and there was a glass bulb, and I said ball, and I bounced it and it shattered everywhere, right? So anything that has the look of a ball, or all I know is a ball is round, everything that fits that, baseball, an orange, the moon, a Christmas ornament, all of that is a ball in that kid's world. That's an overextension, meaning they're overusing the word to describe things that are not that. They're using it too much. They're using it in too wide of a variety. And that's one of the things they just have to learn. You know, you correct them, say, oh no, this is an orange. Oh no, this is the moon. They figure it out. They get it. But it's like that Piaget thing where they have to go and reassess their schemas, right? They have to make new ones. They have to accommodate and assimilate. And then we have under extension. Sometimes they can use things to describe a very narrow set of objects. So maybe a kid, when they say doll, it's not, oh, that's a doll. It's that one doll. All dolls are not called that, but their favorite doll, the one that they drag around everywhere, that's just doll, right? And if they say, hey, I want a doll, it's not any doll, it's that specific doll. Or like we listened in my development site class earlier this year, this woman was a language expert for development, and she talked about her kid, he'd call it Baba. And we're like, yeah, bottle shit. Oh, no. Baba was only the one bottle that he got before he went to bed. She's like, none of the other bottles in the day were called that. He never even talked about them. He knew he got them, got bottles all day long, but he never talked about them. But when he said, Baba, 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 that was the one bottle that he got right before bed. She goes, I don't know why, but that was his under extension. That was the only time. If he said he wanted Baba, that's the bottle he wanted. He did not want any, he didn't refer to any of the bottles throughout the rest of that day. Around 18 to 24 months, all of a sudden you have this vocabulary spurt. So if we go back a stage, this one word sentence, it takes them forever to learn words. Like you can say like orange. It takes them forever to learn what an orange is. Like you have to repeatedly expose them to these things and practice with them and go over it. Like you label everything 20 times before maybe it starts to sink in. They have to be presented with it multiple times. But then you have this magical period happen right before between like a year and a half to 2. It's a massive vocabulary spurt. All of a sudden toddlers realize every single item in the world has a name for it. Every person, everything, every object, it has a name. And for whatever reason, their brains are now hardwired to figure out what these things are. And no longer do you have to expose them to it 10, 15, 20 times. It's more like you tell them once and it is locked in their little spongy minds, right? They just soak it in. Oh, that's a this. Oh, like, oh, that's a marker. Marker, got it. Like then later oh, marker. So I remember when my kid did this, I guess at one point we had been looking at an animal book and I must have been like, oh, that's a koala. We never talked about it. We did nothing about it, nothing. And then we were at a car dealership getting my oil changed and he brought up a book and he pointed to it and he's like, koala. And I was like, how the heck do you know what a koala is? Apparently he had been exposed to it like literally one time and, you know, weeks, months later, he knew it. It was like, oh, koala, like no big deal. So, yeah, their minds are little sponges and they just soak up all of this stuff after one word, and that's called fast mapping. Then we go to 2-word sentences, which is telegraphic stage. So if you know what a telegraph is or a telegram, you used to have to pay for those like by the word or whatever. So you try to make sentences like super choppy sentences to get the message across. So instead of like, meet me at my house at 8 tonight, I'm having a party, be like, my house, 8, party. Like that's it, right? So you get it down to the bones of your needed message. Well, they call 2-word sentence telegraphic speech because these 2-year-olds have edited out almost everything in their language just to get to the point. So it's like 2 words. So like my kid, if he wanted goldfish, he'd just say more fish instead of I want to eat more fish, more fish, more fish. Or go bye, right? I was like, I want to get out of here. I want to go. Instead, he could have expanded on it. Most of us, like if I said, I want more of that, I'd be like, can I have some more of that food? Or I'm really hungry. I want some more. I want to eat more food. No, more fish, more fish. That was it. Okay. And that's why when you're around 2-year-olds, sometimes it's really hard to figure out what the heck they want because they just speak so minimally. And unless you're around them all the time, you might not know what those 2 words actually represent or mean. You know, more fish. Does that kid want to go to an aquarium? What does he want to do? What does he want to do with this more? Yeah, it can be really hard. And then we have the 3-word stage around the time they are 2.5, and they start modifying speech to take into account the listener, the fact that there's another person there having a conversation. And here they tend to do over-regularization of grammar. They're starting to understand grammatical rules. Okay, so like they know ed goes at the end of something. Now, if you were to ask them, how do you make something past tense? They're 2.5. They have no freaking clue. But they do know, oh, when I hear people speak, when I'm learning how to speak, past tense is ed. So, you know, when they learn this, for example, instead of saying the girl went home, they say the girl goed home. They goed home. My kid is 4 and he still does this. He still struggles with it. I'm like, oh, you mean this? And, you know, you just like repeat it to him and yeah, you know, sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't. They figured out this rule. And then when you have weird things like go to went, it's a big jump and it can be hard for him. Or instead of he is the worst, he's the baddest. He's the baddest. Or they just have trouble understanding that this grammatical rule doesn't always apply. Sometimes there's indiscretions or changes you have to go through. And it's one of those things, all this stuff, they just learn by copying and listening and paying attention. You don't have to pull your kid aside, but no, that was wrong, fix it here. You just say, oh, you mean this? And that's it. And they just move on and they'll get it. It's amazing how much of this is just like apparently observational learning to some extent. And then around 3 years old, they use pretty complete and simple sentences. Some kids use more complex ones than others, but they start using sentences to tell stories to people. They use plurals. They're starting to use grammatical rules more correctly. And it's one of these things is as they age, they just learn more rules and how to do it better. You know, I even have kids that are teenagers that, you know, don't know all of the grammatical rules and how to properly say stuff. It's something we learn as we go. But by the time we're 3, we pretty much have a large portion of our language development kind of complete, I would say. So, language acquisition. Let me pause this real quick. Okay, sorry about that pause. So I went over the stuff, babbling, holophrastic, which is just a super fancy phrase for one word. And then we have the 2-word telegraphic speech. So use the notes that we went over. Those are probably better worded than this little layout. Now the question is, how do we learn language? Which we'll talk about in a sec. But when we talk about how we learn language, a lot of people want to bring up bilingualism, right? People who can speak 2 or more, sometimes, languages. And what are the drawbacks and what are the benefits of it? So when we look at bilingual, or people who speak 2 languages fluently, 50% of the world actually grow up bilingual. I would say a fair assessment is that Americans are kind of weird. I mean, yeah, 50%, but still, like, it is not an expectation in American culture that we are fluent in 2 languages, but you have plenty of parts of the world where it is normal. You know, a lot of European countries, they speak their native tongue, but a lot of them also speak English pretty fluently. And in America, you know, we don't start teaching you guys a language till you're in middle school most of the time, unless you raise in a household where it was practiced. And so people wonder, is bilingualism something that's like helpful or hindering of development? So the pros is that when somebody's bilingual, they are better language learners. Somebody who's bilingual could easily learn a 3rd language way easier than somebody who is, you know, monolingual trying to learn that 2nd language. They would struggle. It's kind of like once your brain is wired to do 2 languages, you have the setup needed to be like, oh, I know more about grammar structures. I know more about how languages are set to some extent. Your brain seems to be hardwired better to accept the ability to learn a new language versus somebody who only has the hardwiring for 1 language. The cons, these are like initial cons that go away pretty quickly. Research shows that if a kid is bilingual when they're young, they learn these 2 languages and they have a smaller vocabulary. So if somebody is a small child and only knows English, maybe they know 100 words, right? But then a kid who's bilingual, they know 50 words, but they know 50 words in English, but then they also know them in maybe Spanish or whatever. So the thing is, though, they only have 50 words in each language versus the other kid has 100 words in the 1 language. Eventually, though, the catch-up occurs, and we don't see any cons. Those kids catch up in language development, especially as they age, especially during that fast mapping. And then you have a single language kid that maybe knows 10,000 words or whatever. I have no clue, I'm making these numbers up. Knows 10,000 words. Well, then you have the bilingual kid that knows 10,000 words in English and 10,000 words in, like, let's say, Spanish. So they actually know more. They know twice as many. And their brains are wired, right? They have these neural pathways set up to learn language, which is a huge benefit. Other things we know, there is a correlation. So remember, correlation doesn't mean causation, but there's a correlation that bilingual people tend to score higher on measures of attention control, working memory capacity, abstract reasoning, problem solving. It seems to better protect the brain against dementia and drop in fluid intelligence. All of this stuff is positive, right? So it's one of those things like, why wouldn't we want somebody to become bilingual if they are presented with the opportunity? And so maybe, I always think it'd be interesting to see if the US would ever shift to teaching more bilingual stuff in schools as kids get older, or as they age through the process, because your brains are more plastic when you're younger. And so it would make for, I think, an interesting study for that to happen. I know there are schools out there that do it where, like, I could take my kid, he's only ever been exposed to English, really, like that's all I know how to speak. But there are like Montessori or other schools out there that I could send him to. And what they do is, like, day 1, maybe it's taught in English. They go back, and on Tuesday, it is Spanish. On Wednesday, it goes back to the teacher speaking English. On Thursday, the teacher only speaks in Spanish. And people are, well, that's not fair. How would that work? That kid's not going to understand. No, the kid will be fine, because the deal is, when my kid started learning English from me, he didn't innately know what English was. He didn't know what I was saying. When I'd say, pick up your toy, go do this, come to mom. Like, he had no clue. He had to figure it out. He just had to learn the language and figure out using context and just learn the language that way. If you did that with a little kid, if a kid walked into a room and only had Spanish spoken to him, they'd figure it out really quick. And so you see kids going to these programs where they become bilingual because of this dual teaching going on, this dual language teaching. So in terms of how we actually learn language, whether it's English, Spanish, German, Italian, whatever it is, okay? there's a lot of different theories about how that happens. So the first one is called our social learning theory. And it's B.F. Skinner. He is back. So if you remember him, he's from operant conditioning, and he believes that the only way we do anything in life is through either seeking reinforcements or trying to avoid punishments. And so he says that's how we learn language too. It is reinforcement and punishment based. Baby imitates parent, right? That's that observational learning, so social learning. Mom, dad, whoever, guardian, friends speak, baby eventually starts to copy. So that is observational learning. And when they say something good, when they say mama for the first time, everyone goes, oh, you said mama, good job. So that's reinforcement. So they keep saying it more and more. And then they get reinforced to talk. So they start learning words more and more and more. And every time they say a new one, we get excited and celebrate. And then if they say something wrong or they say something naughty, we punish them and say, no, we don't say that, or no, that's wrong. And we don't give them that praise they want, or maybe they actually have to go in a timeout or get soap in their mouth because they said something bad, right? And so this is social learning theory's argument. We learn language through a series of observational learning and punishments and rewards. So that theory, people had problems with it. Specifically, Noam Chomsky had theories with it. Noam Chomsky is the nativist theory, and he said that there's no way social learning theory has it right. We learn language far too quickly to be reinforced and punished. So I think back to my kid learning the word koala. I had no clue he even knew that word. He had been stewing on that for I don't even know how long before he, oh yeah, that's a koala. Like I didn't even know. I didn't have time to reinforce that when he learned it or punish him. Like I didn't have any time because he learned everything so quickly. And Chomsky's argument is we had to be reinforced or punished for every single language and word, like every word in the language we knew, that would be exhausting. Like my kid's still learning new words. I don't praise him for it. You know, like the other day he was like, this is really difficult. And I was like, oh, how'd you know difficult? He's like, I heard you say it. I was like, oh, okay. Like I don't feel there was a reward there besides recognizing it, but he had learned the word difficult and he had learned how to use it. So cool, you know. Like it was there really, I don't think there was a reinforcement there besides maybe he thought it was interesting and he enjoys learning new words. But still, there's just, that would be a lot of reinforcement continuously. And also punishment, just because I punish my kid if he says like a bad word, like he calls people buttheads, he gets in trouble for it. Guess what? Every day I have to get him in trouble because he calls people buttheads. Just because I punished him didn't erase it from his vocabulary. So Chomsky says, I feel like there's got to be something else. He says that we are born with an inborn universal language acquisition device, or an LAD. Basically says our brains, when we're born, we're just hardwired to learn language. We are just predisposed, predestined to get language. It's like this thing that gets clicked on our head when we're a certain age, when we hear this language, and the machine turns on and we start figuring it out. And so this is where you have that critical period we talked about with development with language come into play. It's one of those things where, yeah, you have this language acquisition device in your brain, but to trigger it, you have to hear language, be exposed to language, and practice language. If you don't do these things, it's not going to ever happen. Now, language doesn't have to be verbal language. If you are a person who is deaf, or for whatever reason you use, I can't think today, sign language, that is still language, right? That is you communicating in some way. And so if you are somebody who is born deaf and you see somebody signing, that will still stimulate the language acquisition device, and you will learn grammatical rules and language. It's one of those things where people said, well, does this machine always work? Does this acquisition device always have the ability to work? What if somebody was devoid of language? No one spoke to them. They had never been around human language. At what point is it too late? And that's, they always call it the unforgivable experiment, or the banned experiment, or the one you can't do. And we can find people, unfortunately, in the world who have been dropped off and raised by legit wolves in nature, or kids who were neglected so severely they weren't spoken to ever. And then see, well, how old were they and can they learn language? Does this language acquisition device, if it's real, if that's how our brains are wired, does it have an expiration date on it from the time we're born? And a lot of theorists will say, yeah, it does. By the time we're 7 or 8, if we haven't heard language and been exposed to it, whether by hearing or visualizing like language out there with sign language or something like that, it might be too late for it to activate, and it's expired and it's done and we can't do it. And so tomorrow in for class, or whenever you do it, if you did it today, great. You're gonna watch Genie Secrets of a Wild Child. And if you take IBS, I think they talk about her in that. But it's this girl who was severely neglected over the course of the first like 13 years of her life or something, 12 or 13 years. And she was beaten if she spoke, and no one talked to her. And they try to teach her language when she is like preteen, teenager. And they show the progress they do and do not make with her and why that might be. Now, works linguistic relativity, it's kind of like instead of how we learn to speak, this is more like how our language dictates our thinking or our cognitive paths. So this one says that language determines the way we think in terms of like the Hopi Indian tribe. They don't have a past tense in their language. And so Worf says that means they rarely think of the past. Their language is reflective on their thinking patterns. I don't have a past tense in our language because past doesn't matter to us. We don't think about it anymore. You know, your culture can reflect. And so I have a mini PowerPoint after this to go over about linguistic relativity that's kind of cool, that shows that language shapes the way you think, or thinking shapes your language. It could go either way. And I do want you to watch the TED Talk about that. I think it's called like Thinking Alters or Changes the Way We Think, or something like that. And so it's super interesting how she talks about it. She's she's very, very well spoken in it, much better than me. And that's her area of study. And she just proves how like language can tell us so much about how that culture works, or the culture dictates what their language is, right? It's like a two-way street. It's super interesting. So I do want you to watch that because it will help you understand linguistic relativity much more. I can't get away from talking about this stuff without talking about Lev Vygotsky. He was in Unit 4. It's usually the questions that everybody gets wrong because he's a footnote. He's like, this young guy died of tuberculosis when he was super, super young. So we don't have that much research. Like, we don't have that much research from him because he died when he was in his 20s, I think. And so the big one he did was like scaffolding. He believes that there's a scaffolding ability in our language development. And he said that by the age of 7, we start to think in words instead of pictures. So there's this whole idea that's still around today that says that kids under the age of 7, or whatever the magic number is, when they are filing away or thinking about things, it's all in pictures. It's picture cards. Flashcards are just pictures on them, right? A slideshow of pictures. Versus when we are older, we actually think in words and we file memories away using words. We can visualize them. That's just the way our brain works. So by the age of 7, we've made that changeover. And he also theorizes that problem solving happens by internalizing your culture's language and relying on something called inner speak. So I always think of like, mom tells a kid no when they're touching something they shouldn't. And they say, no, don't touch that. Okay, I do it to my kid all the time. No, don't touch. Okay, later when he has the urge to touch it, Vygotsky would say he hears his own little voice in his head going, no, don't touch, no. And then he like manages that self-control. So it's the idea that we internalize language, and that's why all of us have those little voices in our heads, which was, I know, a huge article a little bit ago saying how some people don't have that voice in their head, but a lot of us have something in us that Vygotsky would describe as inner speak, where we help control our behaviors because we hear these voices or these like things coming, these verbal warnings coming from somewhere else, or in our memory, our own internal voice. So interesting. He's one who we'd love to have more research on him, but he died of tuberculosis really, really young. And people said, yeah, if this guy had lived, he would be much more famous in the psychology world than he is. And he's still pretty famous for only being a guy who was in his 20s when he did all this. So if we could only imagine if he had lived, 50, 60 more years like some of these guys, he probably would have changed the face of psychology even more. So, do animals use language? Well, depends on what you mean by language. If we mean, do animals communicate? Absolutely. Yes, they communicate with each other all the time. But do they use language? Do they have grammar? Do they have syntax? Do they have all these rules that go along with it? Questionable. So we could say animal language. Sure, each animal seems to have their own type of language. For example, bees do a waggle dance that instruct the others in the hive to where the pollen is. So I'll turn the volume off here. But you can see this little bee shake its little butt and then go around in a little circle. Shakes its little butt again. Does another little loop. That is called the waggle dance. And he is instructing other bees where to fly to find the pollen. Okay, and so it's a communication device for sure, but would we describe that as language like we have? Now, dolphins, sea lions, parrots, they've all been taught language. The question is, are they just repeating stuff, or are they actually using language for their own unique things? So a lot of these parrots, they know how to solve puzzles, so you can tell them to do something and they can respond to the command correctly. They can solve, you know, basic math and things like that. But the question is, when they talk, are they making their own unique thoughts using grammar and the words they've learned, or do they just mimic things? The best results we've had were with chimpanzees. So initially they were trained using American Sign Language, and it was okay. They learned 160 words about, and they could create really, really simple sentences like, you know, eat banana, something like that. Very, very basic. The thing was, they learned the words, but they didn't really use the rules. So like grammar and syntax, they didn't really do that. It was more just that they could imitate what they saw from the people training them, but they couldn't come up with their own unique sets of sentences and thoughts. It just didn't seem to work that well. So what happened was these researchers said, okay, we're ditching American Sign Language, and we're going to use this really funky geometric computer board. It's a touch screen thing with all these weird geometric shapes, and they can use the symbols to create sentences, right? I don't get how it totally works, but I do know that that was kind of the theme about it, these geometric shapes on this touch screen. And for this one, they did show that chimps with this geometric symbols board, they did create their own unique sentences that followed grammatical language rules. Super successful. So way more successful than American Sign Language. The thing is, still debated. People still say, I don't really know if chimps can learn language or not. But they did have more success with these geometric ones showing that grammar and stuff was used. Okay, so I'll put the crash course video up too because it is worth checking out. I have the 2 TED Talks up and you'll have this one. Before I let you go, I do want to go over to, let me share linguistic relativity for you here. Okay, so hopefully this works. Otherwise that would be silly. Okay. So linguistic relativity, this idea of language shaping culture and culture shaping language. So I love this quote, the limits of your language mean the limits of your world. If you don't have a word for something, how in the heck are you going to be able to think about it if you don't know what the word is? So I love the Great British Baking Show. I love that show. I also love RuPaul's Drag Race. Today, 2 contestants from both were chatting. One is from the UK and one is from America. And it was so interesting because they were talking about the word biscuit. And it was so funny to hear the British guy saying, well, like, you said we're making biscuits today, but when I looked at your recipe, it does not look like a biscuit here. And they're like, well, what do you mean a biscuit? And the guy from the UK was like, this is a biscuit. And it was like a cookie sandwich. It's like 2 sugar cookies with like frosting or something in the middle and chocolate on top. And he was like, this is a biscuit. And the American guy was like, oh yeah, that's a cookie. And he goes, well, we have cookies here too. Cookies are things like biscuits are these things that snap. And then a cookie is something that is soft and gooey in the middle. And the guy from America was like, that is also a cookie in America. He's like, well, then what's a biscuit in America? Like, oh, it's a Southern thing that you can put gravy on or jelly on. It's super buttery and bread-like. Oh, it's a scone? No, this guy could not conceptualize a biscuit versus most of us like, yeah, biscuits and gravy, right? You know what that is right away. Or things like that, or like a biscuit that you'd serve with mashed potatoes and fried food. It's very normal for us. But he didn't have a word for that food in his language, in the UK English language, so he couldn't even conceptualize it. If you don't have a word for something, it's very hard for us to figure out. So when we look at language and thinking, grammar, vocabulary, oxymorons, euphemisms, language as a cognitive map for our world, all of these come into how it interacts with our thinking. So I even think of like, okay, grammar, how it's influential of our thinking. Romance languages are a good example. So if you've taken French or Spanish, not German, French or Spanish, go to Italian, they have the idea of formal and informal, you know, versus the informal, like we're buddies or equals, and then you being like, oh, I'm talking to my boss or my teacher. And you also have masculine and feminine forms of nouns. And so if you look at like the feminine or the word victim in French, it is a feminine word. And most professions in a lot of these Romance languages are masculine words. And so that even shows like when these languages were adopted or whatever, when they were created, victim was seen as a more female-centered word, and jobs were more of a masculine thing. So it's reflective on these old cultural values that they had long ago. You have Spanish, shows the importance of a male, really, in theirs. So single is el or la, and then plural is los, regardless of ratio. So if there's all women, it's los. Like if there's 1,000 females, los. If there's 2 females, los. But if there are 1,000 females and 1 male, it is los. If there is the existence of 1 man in there, it's los. If there's 99 males and 1 female, it's still los, right? Males dominate that kind of setting for grammar when you're labeling stuff. Same with French language. So it shows really the power of the male when these languages were created. Vocabulary, I think this is a great category. The Inuits have over 20 words for snow, right? I think in Nebraska, we have different words for snow. We have like snow, we have a dusting, we have a blizzard, we have sleet, flurries, or we have a variety. We don't just have snow or not snow. Like we have a few. The Inuit culture has 20 to describe the different types of snow, you know, wet snow, dry snow. I don't even know all the different types of snow. But it's reflective of snow is really important to their culture and their lifestyle because they get a lot of snow where they live. So they have to have all these descriptive words for it. Fiji Islanders have absolutely no word for snow. They don't need one in their native tongue. They could learn the English word snow and learn what it represents. They don't have one in their native tongue because there's no need. In Fiji, it does not snow. But they have a lot of words for coconuts. For us in Nebraska, a coconut's a coconut, but not for them. Arabic, they have 700 words to describe camels, which for us, it's pretty much like it's a camel. We could describe its color and how many humps it has, and that's about it. Nope, lots of different ones. Hawaiians, different words for tides and waves. A tribal culture in South America, no word for work, it's just stuff you do. And the New Guinea tribal group, some of them have no word for war. You know, it's not something they perceive in that way if they fight at all. Hopi Indians, which we talked about, no past tense. There's a single noun to refer to all flying things except birds. So they would use the same word for a bug, a plane, or even Superman. They all fly, it's fine. Birds would have their own unique thing, but everything else gets squashed into one. Americans, ours, cars. Do you know how many different words we have for cars? Oh gosh, so many. Sedan, convertible, four-wheel drive, hatchback, truck, pickup truck, semi, minivan. Like, oh my gosh, those are so many different words for truck, which a lot of other places have like vehicle. It's a vehicle, that's it. But it shows that we are very tied to our car culture in America for sure, and it has been for a very long time. Vocabulary can present things in interesting ways too. So some of these, you have these slang terms that people, that we use for groups or people that we don't like. And a lot of them, we try to associate them with other things we don't like. So, oh, excuse me. For a man, maybe we don't like, we could say like, he's a girly man, right? It's like supposed to be degrading to some result, or you're making fun of them because you're painting them in something that they wouldn't want to be because it's different or opposite. Another thing that people in languages it's really reflective of your culture and what you represent versus people who are like not native speakers wouldn't get it. So puns, to write with a broken pencil is pointless. We're like, "Oh, that's funny." But if you were a non-native English speaker and just trying to follow, you're like, well, yeah, that's ridiculous. That wouldn't get you very far. And you're like, but it's pointless. Get it? Haha, it doesn't have a point. And they're like, what are you talking about? Be hard for them. Or what happened when the cow tried to jump over a barbed wire fence? Utter destruction. They're funny to us. They're lame, but they're funny. But to somebody who would not be speaking our language, they don't really get it. Same with oxymorons. To have a black light, that's opposite. Black is the opposite of light. To be almost pregnant, you either were or you weren't. A new classic. A classic is old and time and tested by time. How can you have a new classic? A fine mess, opposites. And how can you be all alone? All would mean bunch of people or a bunch of things, and alone means by yourself. So how can you be all alone? And then we have euphemistic language, which are very funny. Words that try to disguise the truth by making it seem less severe, using a more professional tone. So World War I. Initially, the stress that soldiers faced from that was called shell shock. Then we called it battle fatigue, then operational exhaustion, and then eventually PTSD, right? But it used to be called shell shock. Now it sounds much more medical, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we changed the name as we went to make it more acceptable or paint it in a better light. Being blind now, visually impaired is a preferred term, deaf, hearing impaired. But then you have ones like the CIA. Well, they depopulate an area. It sounds so much better than they killed off a bunch of people. A parachute, a vertical decelerator. If a troop or if a military calls for air support, that means bomb. You're bombing them. Pets, since we're obsessed with them. Animal companions or household non-human animal. Unemployed. It's so much better to say, well, I'm a non-wage person. I don't have a wage because I'm unemployed. Messy, you're organizationally impaired. An explosion in a nuclear power plant, you could call an energetic disassembly. It sounds far less scary. Used cars do it all the time. A previously owned vehicle. It's so much nicer to say, well, you're purchasing a previously owned vehicle instead of a used car. It just sounds nicer, right? So it's not changing the meaning. It just makes it sound better. So there are tons of these examples out there, and just how confusing the English language is. It's complex and it is reflective. So this linguistic relativity, it's just saying that our language is reflective of what's important or not important to our culture. If we don't have words for it, we can't think about it. Our language does impact our ability to think or not think about things. So that's all I have for you for language. Please go watch the TED Talks. And if you want to watch a crash course, more power to you. Tomorrow on the agenda is watching the Genie documentary and doing a worksheet, kind of reflective sheet about it as you go. So, and then Wednesday we'll see each other for thinking and problem solving. If you guys get stuck on stuff, by all means, please email me, comment on these posts. I will definitely shoot you a message back. Otherwise, just make notes off to the side, and please be ready to ask them on Wednesday when I see you. So, all right. Thanks a lot, guys.